Let's walk instead of drive. Talk instead of text. Stay out late and count the stars. Let's get back to the things that matter. Welcome to Kinston, a new side of Centera in Loveland, Colorado, for people seeking a new home in a new kind of place, where homes are full of character, life is full of variety, and community means people spending time together. Models are open and new homes are selling. Join us at KinstonCentera.com.
Shanquella was a beautiful child growing up. As me being her father, on the weekends, she would always like to be with me, and when I leave and go to work, she would cry, She was a daddy girl. She was very loving, very caring. She knew the Lord. She went to church. I was about to chill, man, because...
Shanquella Robinson was 25 years old when she boarded a plane bound for Cabo, Mexico on October 28th, 2022.
And sadly, only one day after arriving in Cabo, Shanquella was pronounced dead.
And she called me and told me she had passed. I just started crying. I just hollered. And he said, Mr. Robinson, a statement and what the autopsy review, it didn't add up.
Impact of influence, the Shanquella Robinson story, and our quest to find the truth and find justice for Shanquella. Hello, friend. Welcome. Matt Harris and Seton Tucker here. We're always grateful that you are spending time with us and still working on that social media game. We're weak. If anybody wants to volunteer to be our social media guru, let us know.
Yes, please help. We are not the best with technology.
So we're still on Facebook, Murdaugh Podcast, and you can still email mattharrispodcast@gmail.com. Last episode, we talked about the video with the Cabo 6 and the beating of Shanquella Robinson. And today we're going to have someone on who can break down the differences in the two autopsies. So we have the autopsy from Mexico, which is not a complete autopsy, as we'll find out, but that has really got the controversy going because it says that Shanquella had a broken neck, basically, and would have died within 15 minutes.
And the manner of death was considered violent.
And recall that according to one of the resort workers, the fight, I hesitate to call it a fight because a fight means like two people are doing battle. The beating that Shanquella is getting from Dejanay Jackson is done at like sometime in the morning, right?
Yeah, I think it was 7 to 8:30.
So that's done in the morning. And the Mexican autopsy says she would have died within 15 minutes of the broken neck. Then we also have the police report that says the doctors called about 2 o'clock. So there's a big gap there. What happened in that time? What went on between, say, 9 or so and 2 o'clock?
Yeah, I think that's really the investigation of what happened during that period of time is crucial.
And the Cabo 6 was going around saying that it was alcohol poisoning. So we want to break down the autopsies. The one that was done in the States was just released in April, their findings. And so that's why we bring in our expert. She's been on the show before. We love her. Dr. Michelle Dupre. She is a retired forensic pathologist, former medical examiner, but she began her career in law enforcement with the Columbia City Police in South Carolina. She then became a detective with the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, worked undercover for a few years. After finishing medical school, she completed her residency in pathology at Duke and went on to complete a forensic fellowship in San Antonio with Dr. Vincent DeMeo, known as the father of forensic pathology. And we welcome to the show again, Dr. Michelle Dupre. Dr. Dupre, I've sent you the autopsies from Mexico and from Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. First of all, let's start with the Mexican autopsy. I assume there's a difference as I'm looking at this one and comparing it just as a layperson. There's a difference in how this autopsy was done than would have been done if a similar thing had happened in the States. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. This actually, the one done in Mexico is more like a partial autopsy. And we have a saying that partial autopsies give partial results.
And what is, okay, so what is some of the big things, if you just saw this, you say, well, we're missing this, 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 and this?
Well, we're missing a lot, actually. I mean, this is a very minimal autopsy that was done, and we're missing a really good description of the actual exterior injuries. I mean, there are some that are listed, but they're not very well explained. Normally, we measure any type of injury in 3 dimensions. Certainly, some of these are measured, but again, not to the extent that we would expect or hope here. And also the location. We identify that location in relation to other landmarks on the body, so that if we ever have to go back and sort of reconstruct, the injuries, we would be able to do that. And that's not real easily done here either. And just the lack of thoroughness or completeness in some of these descriptions.
Because the family noted when she came back to the United States, they observed a lot of bruising and stuff that was not noted in this initial autopsy. Exactly.
And of course, the second autopsy definitely describes that. I will say that, and I used to keep bodies overnight that had blunt trauma, because once the autopsy has been performed, bruises will show up a lot easier, a lot better the next day. And I don't know that I doubt that was really done here. But some of these you certainly should have been able to see and describe in that initial autopsy.
The death certificate in Mexico was released November 4th. The autopsy looks like the date was October 30th. And then when it came back to the States, it was first examined on the 17th of November. Then they released the final autopsy report on April 12th. So that is from the time they did the autopsy in Mexico, about 2 weeks. A lot of change can happen in a body, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. The body was embalmed I assume in Mexico. And so that's also going to, make a few changes. But actually, as you know, that's a preservative. So we would still be able to gather a good bit of information.
Well, let me ask you this. It doesn't appear as if there were any sort of toxicology tests conducted in Mexico or the U.S. Would embalming prevent a toxicology result?
Most likely. It would certainly prevent any results from blood or fluids in the body. And depending on the thoroughness of the embalming, sometimes we are able to get toxicology results from tissue, say from muscle samples or something like that. But it's not always accurate. And so you're right. If there were toxicology results done in Mexico, they're not really listed. I did note that the North Carolina pathologist spoke with the pathologist in Mexico, and they discussed some of the toxicology results, which one would be alcohol specific. But that person noted that there was at least 10 hours difference. And as you know, alcohol is going to dissipate. And so I'm not sure how accurate those would have been anyway. And we don't see them reported.
Right. So if someone dies from alcohol poisoning, you would need to run that test within a small hour window to determine that?
No, there are other ways. And what we like to do is we like to not just take blood and urine samples, but we like to take vitreous, which is from the inside of the eye, because that lasts a lot longer. And it tells us a lot about the ante-mortem condition of not just electrolytes and things like that, but glucose levels and even alcohol. And so that's a very useful fluid to take, but it was not done in this case.
And you only have a limited window? I mean, you can't wait 2 weeks to do that, can you? Or can you?
Probably not. Okay, and I say that with a little bit of hesitation because, every case is different. Mm-hmm. And as long as we know the time frame, then we can figure out how the results would have shifted. Okay. And again, one thing that we like to compare often is the blood level with the urine level, because as you know, anything that is in the urine has already passed through the body, and anything that is in the blood is acting on the body now. And so if we compare those two levels, we can often estimate, I guess is probably the best word, the antemortem levels of whatever that drug substance may be.
So on October 30th, they do the autopsy. It was reported, at least. Now you can say what it may really say. They noted that Shanquella's body had a head injury and concluded that Shanquella's cause of death was a broken neck. That's the report. Now, is that what it actually says in this autopsy?
In the Mexican autopsy?
Yes.
Yes, it essentially does. But that was unfounded in the subsequent autopsy.
With what you see, what was released by the Mexican autopsy, is there proof of that, or is it just a conjecture? Is there things you see in the autopsy that would lead you to believe that, or is it just something that's a note of sort?
Well, it is stated in the autopsy that there is this subluxation.
What is that? Explain what that is.
Yeah, what is that?
Okay, so it means basically a dislocation of the vertebrae and where the skull attaches to the vertebral bodies in the neck. I did note in the Chapel Hill autopsy, they did not find that. They did not have that finding. And again, the body was not opened in a way that we normally do here in the U.S., so that we can see a lot of what has gone on. And I think that was, part of the issue is that it just wasn't dissected the way that we normally do.
You're talking about in Mexico, they declared the broken neck, but without doing the kind of procedure that would really prove it.
Exactly.
Okay. So we moved to the U.S. autopsy.
Yes.
And that came out fully released in April, not too long ago. And the big takeaway was of that they did not see a broken neck.
Right.
I know this sounds crazy, but is there any way that the status of that break could have changed in those weeks, or due to autopsy, or due to anything?
No.
Okay.
No, because we also look for, obviously, the dislocation, but we also look for hemorrhage around the area to show that there was an acute injury and that the person was alive at the time. And again, none of this was documented in the second autopsy because that wasn't their finding.
And it said her cause of death was inconclusive. And what does that mean from a professional standpoint?
Basically, it means we don't know. And in reading through both autopsies, there is a lot of trauma. There's a lot of abrasions, which are basically, scratches, which doesn't mean that they're insignificant, but they are described as superficial, but they're all over her body. And then, of course, there are some other things that we have to just medically know that would happen in certain conditions. There was some, what they believe is food particles in her airway and in her lung. She may have aspirated. If she did have alcohol on board and if she had passed out, she may have vomited and then aspirated that. We don't know that. We can't tell that from this. There's also a hypoxic brain injury, which is just lack of oxygen. She could have passed out in a position. I think she was found in the bathroom.
Yeah.
She could have passed out in a position that basically blocked oxygen to her brain. Someone can actually hang themselves sitting on the ground, and that's because of the position. Yes, that's because of the position they're in. That could be the case here. It's called, positional asphyxia. Her trachea and her hyoid bone were completely intact, so we know that there was no strangulation. There was other things that we would normally find. We can rule out a lot of things, but again, ruling in things that actually happened, we just don't have enough information in a timely manner.
Were some of the injuries could be even scratches? I don't know, based on the resuscitation efforts, like the CPR and the defibrillator.
Yes, absolutely. Typically, when there's CPR done, there may be even rib fractures, but they're in a specific location. Her abrasions are basically all over her body. They're on her abdomen, her chest, her back, her hips, her legs, her arms. They're all over. And what they are describing here is patterned injuries. So these are injuries that were caused by some type of an object, and they're linear. And this is something that we would use to describe, and again, not saying that this is what happened, but if someone were hit with a rod, you will find pattern injuries. They will be cylindrical. measuring, perhaps 4 inches long and an inch or so wide. They'll have some sparing of coloration in the middle where the rod actually strikes.
When you were saying scratches earlier, I was thinking maybe human fingernails, but you're saying these scratches and these marks look like beating.
They certainly could. The thing that a lot of them are described as superficial, and again, most beatings are not superficial. They're done with force, and so again, that's a little
I gotcha.
anomaly. And again, I think this is what makes it so difficult to say for certain what the actual cause and therefore the manner of death would be, because there are so many possibilities. Again, just the aspiration from perhaps passing out and vomiting, and then inhaling that and blocking the airways, which would be, an accidental death. But then you can't explain all these other scratches and abrasions. So there's just a lot that we don't know. And I think that the best answer to that is to do exactly what what North Carolina did, and that is to call it undetermined, because that leaves it open so that if additional information is found, then we're able to actually go farther and process the case even more.
Right. So that doesn't mean it wasn't necessarily a homicide. It just they're not sure.
Correct.
Was there any information missing from the autopsies that could have helped the doctors make their determination?
Well, again, I think that the North Carolina autopsy is very complete and very thorough for what they had at the time. I don't think there's any more that we could probably gain from that. And so really what it boils down to now is the investigation part. And that, that time has passed now. That's something that would need to be done with the people that were present shortly before her death and during that time. And other than that, as far as physical evidence, I don't really see that there's much more we could learn from this.
Okay, so the Mexican autopsy said broken neck, which we learned from the state autopsy that there wasn't a broken neck. But let's say there was a broken neck. Does that person die within 15 minutes?
And again, that does vary. That's reasonable. You would lose consciousness certainly before that. And it may not take quite that long, just depending on how severe it really was.
Okay. How about when she's aspirating or vomiting, or if her head is in the position where it's almost like she's hanging? How long does that take?
Let's say that, somebody is choking you with their hands, and you pass out. You pass out within, probably a few minutes, a couple of minutes maybe. They're choking both sides of your neck. If they let go, you wake up. If they don't let go, then you die. If you are only, let's say you're sitting down and you're in a position that one of your carotid arteries in your neck is occluded or not giving oxygen to the brain, then it's going to take much longer. You can still die from that, but only one side is being cut off. And again, it's that lack of oxygen and how soon or how long the brain is without it. So anywhere from, a few minutes, several minutes to maybe 15 would certainly be reasonable.
But once you stop it from being cut off, then you're not going to die from that. Unless you're brain dead or whatever. But I mean,
right. Yes. As soon as you release the pressure, then you regain consciousness.
When there's something like a beating, and we're not going to talk about this specifically, but in general, when somebody's beat up, can they possibly die hours later from a beating? Or
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, yes. The internal examination of the organs did not prove this, but in some cases, you may have a lacerated spleen, or you may have a lacerated liver where you bleed internally, and it can be several hours later that you actually succumb to death. In this case, we didn't find that. But if she were beaten, if she passed out, and then if she aspirated, that could be some time in there that took. It could even take maybe up to an hour or so, or it could be sooner if the aspiration was significant and completely blocked the airway.
I'm not guessing on this particular case, everybody, but let's say something happens. Someone gets beaten in the head, because that rules out the organs you mentioned. They're
Right.
beaten in the head. That causes them perhaps to aspirate because concussions can cause you to throw up or whatever, right?
Right.
And you could be alive for a while, but the cause of the head injuries could have caused what led to things down the road. Is that a possibility?
It is. It is actually. And again, of significance is that there were no skull fractures found. So you can have what we call a coup and counter coup injury. If you if you picture your brain as a basketball in a tub of water and you hit one end of the tub, the basketball bounces from one side to the other. That's coup and counter coup injury. So your brain will have these injuries, possibly even bruises or contusions with some bleeding, but definitely swelling. And if that swelling is such over a period of time, again, depending on the severity of the injury, it causes a midline shift. So it causes the medulla, which controls your breathing, to become out of place, and then you would die. And again, it depends on how rapidly that happens, how significant the swelling is, and all that. So there's just so many things like this that we don't know.
Right.
Did we see swelling in the brain in the autopsies?
It is not described, no. And there is hypoxic ischemic brain injury, which does mean that there was lack of oxygen.
Okay.
Microscopic examination was done, and so it does show some of these things. It also shows some subarachnoid hemorrhage, again, which typically is from some type of a strike, to the brain, and that causes that hemorrhage. That doesn't usually, in many cases, it doesn't really cause death, but it certainly could. There is also, sections were taken of the spinal cord and different parts of the brain that really didn't show significant injury.
Are there any other observations that you have before we let you go?
No, again, I would just, something that we often see is something we call pertinent negatives, and they can be just as important as what we do find. And I think this case has a lot of those, and some of those we certainly already talked about, like the lack of skull fractures, the lack of injury to the hyoid bone or the thyroid. We can rule out manual strangulation. So there's several things like that we can rule out because of these pertinent negatives, but we just don't have enough to rule things in.
Yeah. Dr. Michelle Dupre, you're one of our favorite guests of all time. We always appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
We'll talk soon. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
If you want to reach out to Dr. Dupre, it is DMichelle, D Michelle Dupre, DUPREMD.com. DMichelleDupreMD.com.
It is always a pleasure to talk to Dr. Dupre. We had a comment from our Facebook page, which is still titled Murdaugh Podcast. We hope to be transitioning that over soon. And this person says, I love this podcast from start to finish. They're referring to a Murdaugh podcast, but if it is over, which it's not, we're still covering that. I am glad you guys are working on the Shanquella Robinson story now. The transparency of your reports and shared information is the best.
And we will just follow it wherever it takes us. So we appreciate that.
And we hope that our true crime people will stick with us. Impact of influence.
Yes, and more cases to come. We love it. We got a lot of recommendations on cases we should take up. We're working our way through them, but we're going to continue the Shanquella Robinson case. And again, as we said, still Murdaugh Podcast on Facebook and Matt Harris Podcast at gmail.com. We're always grateful you spend time with us, and we'll talk soon, friend.